Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to Synapse yearly speaker series. And so I'm really excited to welcome Lesley McClurg to the Synapse speaker series today. Lesley McClurg is a health correspondent for KQED, and her work is regularly aired on numerous NPR and PBS shows. She has won several regional Emmy Awards, a regional and a national Edward R. Murrow Award, and the Society of Professional Journalists has recognized her reporting several times, and the Society of Environmental Journalists spotlighted her ongoing coverage of California's historic drought. Her recent work includes extensive coverage on the COVID-19 pandemic, safety nets under the Golden Gate Bridge, and staffing shortages in nursing homes. And I believe Lesley will give everyone here some insight as to how she became a journalist and what the experience is like in being a journalist in the Bay Area. So, Lesley, take it away.
Sure. Thank you so much for that kind introduction and welcome everyone. I think that I have a pretty short story in terms of how I became a journalist. I was one of those kids who I have a 5-year-old now, and the only thing that she does is ask questions over and over and over and over and over. And I just continued that from, like age 3 till now. It's the thing that I'm sort of known for, is just to be like, but why? But why? And just over and over. And as I was a kid, we have these great family recordings of me running around the room at Christmas and asking all of my relatives, questions, and then packaging that into a news story of what happened on Christmas. So I think it's just, honestly, it feels a little bit like it's in the genes and kind of always has been. And I had a pretty straightforward, track, in the sense that I went to J school, I went to journalism school. I got a job at a PBS station in Seattle right out of school, and tried out television for 4 or 5 years, and then eventually made my way into radio, and I've been there ever since. And so I could, obviously the career track has some ups and downs and some twists and turns, and but that's kind of it. I mean, I think there's something about a journalist, most journalists, and I think that is that there is like this innate curiosity. I also think that we have a short attention span because I think if you're going to be a scientist, you're incredibly curious, but you can hone in on a question really, really deeply for a really long time. And I think there's something in a journalist that is a little, almost like, not literally ADHD, but like a little like, oh, I'm fascinated in this for 24 hours, or I'm fascinating in this for 48 hours. And I definitely have that. My colleagues describe me as sort of the ER doc of a newsroom, in the sense that I could never be a long form investigative journalist. My attention span is much too short. I like quick, impactful, kind of stories that you can really digest, on a short time frame, and then I get a little bit bored and I'm curious about something else. So that's kind of me as a journalist. And what I'd love to talk to all of you about is, over the last 20-25 years of doing this, there's kind of a recipe that I think works, and then was very challenged during the pandemic. And so I want to kind of talk about, how what my approach was, and kind of how that has evolved in the last 4 years. So I have a PowerPoint, mostly to keep me on track, so that I continue to say, kind of keep my train of thought. So I will share that now, but I highly invite folks to ask questions at any time, interrupt me. Honestly, I think today is an evolving conversation inside of myself, as much as it is my expertise that I'm offering any of you. And like I said, the pandemic really threw everything in my face in terms of the things that I thought I knew about journalism and what I thought I knew about telling stories. And so I'm still kind of figuring out and digesting that. So interrupt me. In other words, don't let me just wax on. I will share my screen now. And so basically, for a long time, and still, I believe that storytelling is really our superpower. And that is, true for journalists. That's true for all of us in our day-to-day interactions. I think that's definitely true for all of you who are in the science field. the more that you can tell a compelling story about your work to us in journalism, to the people around you, the more likely you're going to get grants, get things funded, the more likely that information is going to get out there. And I think as humans, it's one of the few things that really sets us apart as a species, is that we can tell really powerful stories and do it well. And that's, fortunately, I feel like kind of my gift, is finding a really good story to package information. So for example, just this week, I was covering a bill in Oakland that's going to give protections for folks who experience housing discrimination if they are polyamorous. That could be like, a quick story, but I asked myself pretty quickly, why do polyamorous people need housing protections? Like, are landlords really delving into the romantic intricacies of people's lives and asking what's going on in their bedrooms? And I comes to learn after talking to folks who are advocates for this bill that yes, in fact, they have experienced a lot of discrimination, and it's a pretty challenging landscape to watch or to walk. And so telling the story of a man who has moved multiple times in the last 4 or 5 years and, has had landlords basically call him a slut and try to raise his rent, created a much more compelling story and highlights the issue, I think, in a way that people can potentially care about the issue. And so I try to do that no matter what the story is. I try to find a person with a compelling personal interest in the story that you can identify, a character that you're going to like, try to build out that character, make them very real, and so that you're going to care about the news story, whatever news nugget that they are representing. Let's see, how do I go ahead? Sorry. Let's see, 1 second. Why can't I not make my screen? Okay, we go, sorry. There we go. So, I think that, like I said, our brains are really wired for storytelling. If we look at brain scans, it really shows that the vivid details that I might tell you about someone or the story that they are engaging in, that region of the brain lights up that is just like as if you were experiencing that. And so it really illustrates that that our brains are meant to take in the stories of other people and feel them and experience them for ourselves. And I believe that kind of neural mirroring really helps us create empathy and understanding, and then helps us hopefully care about whatever the news is that I'm writing about, or any other journalist. And I think that one thing to sort of highlight about my own journey and journalism in general is that I was hired about 11 years ago as a KQED health journalist correspondent, not because I have some sort of amazing scientific background. I don't, in fact, at all. I was hired because I can tell a pretty good story. And I was confronted with whether or not I could do that job very, very early on in my career here at KQED. The first couple of months that I was here, I was handed a study that I had a few hours to basically turn around a quick web article about. And it was about why some of us are more prone to risk, why some of us are going to become, addicted, basically. Why some of us, become addicted to video games or gambling, or more prone to that. What's happening in some of our brains that makes us more prone to that? And this researcher at Stanford was looking at that, what's happening in the brain, using a study using rats. And I got handed the study, and I've never covered a medical study in my life, and I had no idea what it said. I was completely lost. So I called the researcher, I had a conversation, I tried to pretend like I understood what he was talking about. I hung up the phone. I'm now a half an hour closer to my deadline. I still had no idea how to cover this. Called him a few more times, tried to ask a couple more questions, tried to wrap my head around this. I was completely lost, to the point that I walked into my editor's office and I said, I'm not your person. I can't do this. I don't have the medical expertise to cover science. I don't understand what this author is saying. And she said, great. Our listeners won't then either. So you've got to get that scientist to talk to you and make them clearly articulate what that research is about. And so I called the researcher back and I said, okay, can you use some kind of an analogy? Like, what is this like? And he's like, well, I guess let's talk about it as if, we're at a casino and what people are more prone to do and what's happening in their brains as they're doing that. And so this is the opening line of the story that I eventually write. Some people walk into a casino and they head to the nickel slots. Others march straight to the roulette table with their life savings. Why is that? And then throughout the entire story, through the study, which I had like an hour to write, I was able to walk people through using the casino metaphor and for myself to then understand what this researcher was talking about and, continue to push scientists to package their information so that it's digestible and in analogies that regular people can understand. And so I think the challenge that I have every single day that I'm faced in this landscape, and especially covering very complex information from scientists, is that my job is to summarize that information. Often I have 55 seconds in a radio spot. That's one soundbite, maybe 5 sentences total, to summarize what a researcher has probably spent 2, 3, 5 years researching. And then after that, I've got 55 seconds on the radio and a web article that I have to pump out in a few hours. That's in a very competitive landscape, right? We are getting an onslaught of information all of the time. And we're in a clickbait culture with social media. And I'm competing against everyone else for their attention, right? And people, I think there's a lot of research showing that our attention span is getting shorter and shorter. And so you're competing for someone's attention. Maybe they're going to read the headline. Hopefully they're going to read the first couple paragraphs. But how do you get them to stay through the entire article? It's a real challenge in today's landscape. Unfortunately, sensational headlines, emotional sound bites, they work. And that's why, news media uses them. But as we all know, that is often not the most accurate way to reveal information to the public. I am totally guilty of this, but it is so much easier to call the best talkers, the scientists who can package their information in sound bites, who speak in sound bites, who have a vibrant personality, who make it easy to understand. If they have good marketing skills for their information, it helps. And so I unfortunately have to encourage scientists to learn those skills, that it's part of building the bridge, which is what I'm hoping I will help you all understand today, really building the bridge between science, between the ivory tower and media. And it's just an unfortunate part of it is that the folks who are really good at TED Talks get their scientific information out there easier. And so building on those skills is important. I think the problem, or at least how I've seen it over the years, and the challenging part is that science is a very ongoing process, right? A study often, it doesn't make sense to write a really quick clickbait headline to summarize something. That's not accurate. Science is nuanced, but unfortunately, people really want simple, digestible information, and they want known. They want known information that they can trust, right? They want to know, do they need to wash their vegetables or do they not need to wash their vegetables to catch COVID? Period. They don't want nuance. They don't want to have to think about it more than just straight, direct information. And as we all know, oversimplifying information is what leads to errors. So how do you do this? Over the years, I developed what I thought was a really sound recipe. And this is what I taught scientists to do. I taught scientists, I'd get on the phone, I'd ask them about their study. And the first question I'd say is, okay, you're standing in an elevator. You've all probably heard this, right? The doors are closing. How do you describe exactly what your study is about before the doors close? And I might work with someone for 10 minutes to get them to summarize it in that one succinct line. And then I'll give them a little more time. How would you summarize this over drinks with a friend, at night? Someone who has no scientific background, how do you summarize it to them? And then how do you explain this to a 5-year-old? And then, so that gives me enough information as someone who does not have a medical background, several different options of explanations that have come from the scientists directly who have summarized it, so that when I summarize it exactly how they would summarize it succinctly and shortly. And then you get into more of the nuts and bolts of an article. And this is what I want to hear about from a scientist to get the quote, sensational sound bites from them. Why do you care about it? Why should I care about what you're doing? That's not the methodology of a study, but it helps people then care about the information that's in that study or that piece of research. And I use this, sort of example, what is it like? And I did a story, I did a story about like the anniversary of the of this. I'll just summarize here. What is it like? And the scientist says the team settled on a parachute to slow the spacecraft as it hurled through the Martian atmosphere. The engineers also wrapped the machine in a cocoon to protect it when it touched down on the rocky landscape, kind of like a beach ball. So the spacecraft landed kind of like a beach ball. So you're looking for those, like, what is this thing that you've made? What is it actually like? What, is it like a telephone? Is it like a beach ball? Is it like an inhaler? Is it, like a giant building? Whatever it's like, you want an analogy for whatever you've built so that the average brain can understand what's happening inside the laboratory. And then what don't we know? So that there's the nuance of like, this is a piece of research that's probably evolving. It may change. We want to make sure that gets in there. And where do we go from here? So these are the questions that I always ask when I jump on the phone with a scientist to do a quick, story. These are the things that if you're presenting your research, if you have something that you want to get out in the media, you should have really accessible in your explanation so that when you speak to the media, we summarize it accurately and do it well that is digestible for a regular audience. So that's what I thought. That was the recipe that I lived and breathed on for 15 years of my career. And then the pandemic hit. And kind of all of that was thrown in my face. And just as kind of a fun story. So I remember on January 22nd of 2020, I got a call from the editor at the national desk at NPR, and he said, "Hey, there's a new virus in China. Can you, bolt down to SFO and talk to people who are coming in from Wuhan?" And I said, "Where?" And he said, "Wuhan." And I was like, "Can you spell that?" And I jumped in an Uber and I headed to SFO. And fortunately, a flight from Wuhan was coming in that day, which was, they only came in a couple of days a week, so it was kind of surprising. I get to the airport. I'm standing outside of customs, and there's 12 flights coming in from all over the world, many from Asian countries. And I thought, how am I going to, recognize people coming in from Wuhan? And luckily, people started dribbling off the plane who were wearing masks. And I started asking them, what is the virus like in China? And what is life on the ground like in China? And are you scared about catching the virus? And the overall tenor, honestly, the sound bites are comical to listen to now, because it was like, no, I'm not at all scared. I'm here for Lunar New Year. I've never been out of the country. My government's going to take care of me. I'm totally safe. This is not a big deal. Basically no worries. And then at the end of the story, I summarized it with the information that we had that, again, is kind of comical at the time, which was this virus seems to be in the family of viruses that is, SARS. It's a coronavirus. We saw SARS in 2014. 500 people died. It doesn't, and I remember the line was, "It doesn't look like this virus is going to be nearly that deadly." And, I said it with confidence. And, we put it on the air. It aired nationally. Obviously, 2 months later, you all know that, we were on complete lockdown, and we know the rest of the story, right? Millions of people have died of COVID. So I was completely and totally wrong. That story was an absolute opportunity to say, and it was not in the story, the editor, neither of us put it in there, this is an evolving story. This is a novel virus. We don't know anything about this virus. We'll update you. This will probably change dramatically in the coming weeks. None of that was in there. We confidently said, you get a dry cough, you may get pneumonia. It doesn't look to be as deadly as SARS. And so I think that is our tendency in media, is to provide confident summaries. And we learned often covering COVID that really bit us as the story evolved. And I started, covering that story. I had a 1-year-old at the time, and I threw myself into this story. This is the most important story I thought that we would cover our time, our life. And that's probably true. But 4 years later, still sort of acting like it was breaking news for that long, it was the most painful and exhausting story that I've ever covered. And almost, I almost turned in my pink slip and quit journalism because it was so hard. And many journalists did throw in the towel because it became such a painful story to cover. And this is part of it. Part of why it was so painful is that the story kept changing. And it's such an illustration of the scientific process, right? This is a headline I wrote. The flu is still a bigger health threat in the US than the novel coronavirus. That was January 29th of 2020. A few months later, obviously, that was no longer true. Cleaning produce in the age of coronavirus. Take these food steps, rinse and repeat. We all know that, the coronavirus is not, you're not going to get it from your vegetables. But at the time, we all probably spent a lot of time washing our vegetables. I don't know if you all remember back in the day, but our COVID tests didn't work in the beginning. And so that, right from the get-go, people didn't have trust in sort of the government and how the government was going to take care of you to even tell you if you had this particular virus. And then you had a president who obviously was a little bit difficult on this story numerous times. I think it was April of that year, the CDC recommended masks. And Trump comes out at the first press release and says, yeah, you should wear them. They might help. I'm not going to wear one. So obviously that doesn't help when public health officials or the leader of the country are not all on the same page, which is why one of the many reasons that this was a very difficult story to cover. I think it's fair to say that then over the next 4 years, we as a country are still suffering from how that story was told and how the pandemic evolved. 4 years of conflicting messages, changing guidance from public health officials, really left people, confused and highly, highly skeptical of scientists, of government officials, and of the media. And I get it, right? It was a really challenging time filled with a lot of unknowns. These are the people that you turn to, and their message is changing constantly. And so what do you do about that, right? Like, what could we have done differently? And this is really where I am still deeply in that question of what we could have done differently. And I'm honestly not totally sure. And I hope our conversation today can kind of explore that. But what I did learn is that people really want and they expect confident, accurate information, and they want it very accessible, basically in a headline format. They want to know, is this variant going to kill you? And they want to know it now, right? Unfortunately, that's not how science works. That's not how variants work, right? They mutate constantly, and we don't actually know how dangerous it is until we have enough cases to actually evaluate that. But headlines and the news cycle work to feed the beast, which is the public's need for information that's clear and accessible. I think I learned that those simple summaries, those confident summaries, can be really dangerous. I learned that flashy headlines really misconstrue the information. I wrote many. And I don't really know how to not write a flashy. You can't write a long, nuanced headline with all the different potential possibilities of what could, yes, you might need to wash it for 6 months, but it's really difficult to write out all those nuances. So how do you write a headline that's accurate in an evolving landscape? And my overall takeaway is that this starts from many different sectors of society. And one of the main ones is that we must teach people that science is an evolving process, that most people just really don't understand that, whether wine is good for you or coffee is good for you, that's an evolving amount of information, and it depends as the body of literature grows, whether or not we know whether or not you should have a glass of wine at night or whether or not you should have a cup of coffee in the morning. And so we must teach people that evolving process is the way that it works. And I don't think that most people know that. And I think if I could go back to all of my stories, that level of nuance, I would have wrapped the information in. Whether or not that would have made a difference, I still don't know. But I do think that the media, that this starts, in schools, that people need to understand the scientific process from the beginning. I think that government officials that come up to their lecterns and they offer the news of the day in their press releases also need to offer that caveat This is what we know today. It may change. I think they did that sometimes. Did they do it enough? And would it have made a difference? I'm not sure. But it definitely needs to be part of the conversation. I still do believe that part of the recipe is that stories still work, that we as humans are sort of wired to listen to things in a story that you can walk up to a water cooler with your colleague and you can summarize quickly. So I still do believe in that. Do simple stories work? Do headlines work? They're still part of the landscape. So how do we do that, and how do we do that well? So I think my takeaway is that it's both simple, like we still need a simple narrative, but it is also nuanced. So really becoming a solid journalist in this moment, really becoming a good science communicator is being able to find both, is to be able to communicate, both a simple story that is nuanced, that's wrapped in nuance, so that it's memorable and it lands well with the audience. I think that transparency and humility must be part of the process. I think people who are high level institutions, public health officials, even some of the best journalists in the country, are not always so humble and are not so forthcoming in admitting that they made a mistake. They try to like rewrap it in a different marketing. But I think just coming forward and saying, I made a mistake is and could have given people more credibility in our institutions. That's just my own opinion. This is not going to be easy. I do think it's possible, and I do think it's really necessary that we work on how to package stories and information and science in a way that people care about it. And so I'm want to open it up now for questions, from folks in terms of what are they interested in about this process, or anything that I spoke to, or about my own career. I'm open to any of it if folks have questions.
I think I saw Hailey Kim. Did we see a hand there? Or maybe not. Carson?
Hi, yeah, thanks for the talk. One thing I was wondering, as a journalist listening to scientists, and I think, as a training scientist currently too, I want to try and learn the skill better. But when you're talking to an expert in their field, how do you as a journalist evaluate what you're hearing and try and portray how confident you can be in in what you're hearing from someone who is an expert? Because I think one of the challenges too during the pandemic was that there were experts who were, there were experts or so-called experts who were spouting things that were contradictory with one another. And I think that's another challenge that, there's these wars of people citing different perspectives on a topic on all sorts of things related to the pandemic. So yeah, I'm just curious to hear your perspective on how you deal with that as a journalist.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal question. And it's tricky because you can obviously just quote them all, right? You can just get every single different viewpoint, or try to get a mixture of viewpoints and throw them all in one article, and then trust that your listeners or your readers, can figure it out. And I think that's kind of more old school journalism. And I think there's been a movement as the attention span and sort of the soundbite culture and clickbait culture has expanded to go in the other direction and have an expert or two. And I think there's some mix in between there. And what I in terms of the amount of experts that you put in, the amount of opinions that you put in there, because you do need a mix, right? I think the thing that I really try to do as a journalist is to develop sources that I really trust, that people who I know will give, and basically that's just like trial and error. But over the course of the pandemic, there were people that I used to vet. So if a new study comes out, I call my handful of 4 or 5, 6 experts and say, what do you think of this? Is it worth going out there? Is it new information? Is this person accurate? And unfortunately, it's a very human endeavor, right? Like, how do I determine that person is trustworthy? The same way that you determined that reading, say, the Wall Street Journal feels more trustworthy to you than the Washington Post or the New York Times or the Atlantic. It's kind of like an innate thing that I've developed, and usually it's because they have a track record. So it's someone that I've called over and over and over, and their information has panned out to be accurate in sort of a longer arc. And that comes, simply, unfortunately, with time, right? Being on the beat for a long time. And a journalist, someone who's hired right out of the gate, or someone who was a sports reporter yesterday, but they're a health reporter today because a pandemic just hit, right? There was no sports coverage. Do you remember? There was no comedy coverage. There was no TV reporting in the first couple of months. Everyone on deck in every single newsroom was covering the pandemic. Most of them didn't have any health background. And then, even people like me who had been in the business for 12 or 15 years, I don't have a medical background, and I'm trying to read these studies. So we depend on our experts. And unfortunately, those source lists take time over years to develop. So there's no easy answer to that question other than I think you got to ask a lot of people. I remember I'm spacing on his name right now. Anyways, a journalist that I really highly respect at the Atlantic, Ed Yong, excuse me, who did a ton of reporting during the pandemic, said he would call, any study, he calls 12 to 13 experts. Often on deadline, you don't have that much time. I don't know how he does that, but he's doing long form pieces for the Atlantic. But someone like me who's on daily deadline, I don't have that kind of time. But the 2 or 3 people, 4 people that I do call, I better have a lot of trust in. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ramin.
Yes, hi. Hi, Lesley. Thank you for the fantastic talk. So social, our phones basically behave like a digital leash for all of us, right? And social media companies have invested a great amount into figuring out algorithms, in particular ways to exploit human attention. And as a result, like you said, our attention spans have gotten much smaller, and it's essentially actually the whole clickbait culture has created a bottleneck effect for journalists, where there's a natural selection happening for people in your position to be able to create content that can fight against other people's, to capture somebody else's attention. And this is just progressively getting worse and worse throughout the years. So has there ever been an attempt, through journalism or other means to kind of fight back against what's happening to our attention spans, and to be able to educate people on that? Or are we at a point where essentially we're powerless and we're just going with the drift towards that direction of attention spans continuously getting shorter and shorter, and there's nothing we can do?
I mean, I think there has. I remember, covering, there's been various efforts, right? There's been the unwired weekends where you these organizations that have tried to show us, how things are working in terms of our brain, and that leash, that digital leash, like you talked about. We can shine a light on those organizations that are doing that. There's the Tristan Harris, he has an entire organization sort of based on teaching people about how these companies are using psychology and psychological experts and marketing experts to play with our psychology and get us addicted to our phones and play with our dopamine, so that we get a little hit every time we get a like or a share or whatever. And so that we are, my phone's right here, I need it right here, right? All the time to get that little. And so I think there have been efforts to do this and to cover it. And I've tried to cover it, right? I think one way is okay, you can teach people they're tracking you, they're taking your data, they're, manipulating you. And we can try to teach people that. Unfortunately, they're so good at it that I know I'm a total, I'm not ahead of it just because I know it's happening. It's not like I don't fall for it on a fairly regular basis. And it's so stitched into our culture. The truth, to answer your question, I'm not super optimistic that these efforts are making much headway. I think that the companies, this is kind of comes back to capitalism, right? You've got companies that are quarterly based profits, and that's a short-term turnaround, meaning that the more they get our attention, the more money they make. And there's no incentive for them to try to take care of our psychology. whether or not policies, may come into play to help that, I just worry that it's a little late. And I don't know what to do about it. I mean, I think as a culture, like on a more positive sense, as a culture, I was thinking about this last night. We don't value journalism in the same way that we value other industries, right? Like we don't pay our teachers well, but we have teachers and we're going to employ them and we're going to have people who can teach us. 21,000 journalists were fired last year, or were let go, I should say, of organizations. 21,000. They're not replaced. No one's going to try to replace them. The government doesn't care, like in I shouldn't say the government doesn't care, but there's not government funding to ensure that journalism continues. And so I think as a society, do we care about information and sort of the accountability that journalism offers our society? I think that's kind of a bigger question, but it's a very difficult moment in the digital landscape. And I don't think that, it's going in the right direction with AI and ChatGPT, coming online. That's another very scary aspect to all of this. There's a lot of articles that I write that I could, that especially those daily articles that I could ask ChatGPT to write. Now, I don't think that's happening so much yet, but how soon will it? I think that's unknown.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I wish I had better answers for you.
No, that was great. Thank you. I do actually have a second question if there's no one else in line, kind of
Please.
separate from this. How do you find work-life balance? You said you have a 5-year-old. As a journalist, how does that blend into your life, and how difficult it is to be a mother while being a full-time journalist with daily deadlines?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I have chosen personally work-life balance over, writing. A lot of journalists are highly motivated to write books or to work overseas, or to, journalists are, maybe I could say, like academics, in that they want accolades. They want to go big with their work. They want to have the biggest splash. I chose, when I had my daughter, to turn the other direction and turn towards my family. So I personally have a pretty balanced lifestyle. I think NPR has the benefit of that we don't have other competitors on the radio. So there's not, at least we don't see them as big competitors. There's not the same ferocious kind of competition to be the first out there if it's on the radio, that I would feel in a print newsroom. And NPR doesn't try to be everything. We're not trying to be the New York Times and be on every single story. And so I think that also kind of helps with work-life balance. But if I was trying to climb to the top of my career, and I wanted to be a foreign correspondent, or if I wanted to, really launch, work-life balance would be a lot more challenging. Honestly, the thing that's more challenging is, as a journalist in San Francisco, is that it's not a career that pays very well. Unfortunately, it's really a passion career. And so for those of you who are, thinking about it, probably, if you're thinking about an academic career, it may be similar. But if you're thinking about, biotech or some other, potential path in science, there are much more lucrative paths. And it's a challenging career to get into. That said, it's, I think, a very, very rewarding career, in the sense that you just get to learn all day, and you get to learn about the most varied subjects all the time. And most of the time at this point in my career, I'm driving. I show up every day and determine what I want to cover. Very rarely is an editor saying you must do it this way. So that's a lot of fun. But I pay a price in my paycheck.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I guess I have a follow-up question to that. So is being a journalist at KQED like a very individual job, or is there like team-based work? Do you talk to other journalists in um the to discuss like stories to
Newsroom.
cover? Yeah, the newsroom. Yeah.
Yeah. I would say journalism is a pretty solo path in the day, kind of like a writer. There's usually, I mean, I should say the majority of your time, that's how I should say it. You're usually working on a desk, like I work on the science desk. that has both the science desk here at KQED that's linked to the national desk, the National Science Desk. So we have a morning meeting that discusses kind of the news of the day, who's going to cover sort of breaking news, who's going to cover or stay on sort of the more longer form stories that take a few days to turn out. So there's kind of a moment in the morning where you're kind of in a group. More and more of that, unfortunately, is taking place online, and people are working more and more at home. Back in the day, the newsroom used to be a really fun place to hang out and kind of just full of buzzing ideas. It's loud, like it was just like people running all over. You walk outside right now in the KQED newsroom and it's totally quiet. So because most people are working from home. But then once after you have that morning meeting, you're mostly on your own reporting throughout the day. So maybe you're in the field talking to people, for your story. Maybe you're on the phone talking to people, depending on if it's for web or if it's for audio and you need to be there. And then you're writing it, and you may come back with other folks, and you just work with editor to sort of work through your script. And then you hand over the materials like audio, et cetera, to an editor to put the piece together. That's true at a big station. Back in the day, at smaller stations, you actually do all the audio editing yourself as well, and you track the story, to be on the radio. So I would say it's a mix, but probably 80% of my day is solo, kind of driven by myself. That's obviously different if you work on a podcast team or if you're working on a big investigative story with a couple other journalists. So at times you do come together, or if you're working on a show, like for example, I sub for Forum, which is the daily radio talk show that KQED puts out. And then you're working with the producers and kind of thinking about what the show is going to be about, throughout the day. But even prepping for that, I'm doing it on my own. I'm reading the articles or watching the movies or whatever it is during the day on my own. So it's a mix, I would say, but mostly solo. I'm curious from folks, did anyone during the talk have any thoughts about how the media could have done it better, or experiences that they had during the pandemic where that kind of illustrate how we could have done it better so that we didn't end up in the place that we're at with an incredible, sort of public trust issue with scientists, with the media? Is there any way that we could have done it better? Do any of you have any thoughts about how that could have gone better or could go better in the future? Help make my life easier going forward.
I don't know if this answers your question. I guess it's going a step back. I've been thinking about how society really separates the arts and writing with science. And I think it's super cool that you worked at the intersection of that. And in the United States, I feel like the government values science, tends to lean more science than arts. And then it's interesting how in Spain, for example, they leaned more arts than science. And there's a textbook that I had to read for class in undergrad that argued that that was part of the reason that their economy didn't do well. And so I'm kind of grappling with the idea of like, how should we be changing education, if at all? Like, should science and arts and writing / English not be separate subjects? Like, should they be more integrated? Is it ethical when like humans love stories and some humans love to write stories, to have these programs that really go into people's passions, but then there might not be a paying job afterward? I feel like if it were taught to us at a younger age that science and English and arts aren't like two completely separate subjects, that would reduce the like whole COVID issue of people not understanding that science is an art. Yeah, so kind of going in circles. I'm curious if you had any thoughts on that.
No, I think it's a good point. I feel it every day in my own work, in the sense that often I'm dealing with hard data or hard scientific evidence or hard, research, whatever. And then I'm packaging it in a very creative or artistic way so that people pay attention to it. And so there very much is both parts of me working all the time. And so the fact that, I think you're right, the fact that they're taught very separately from a very young age is potentially that could be different. and potentially done better. I think, for those folks on this call, who might lean one way or the other, like, if you don't have both of those, I just want to make it very clear that there's plenty of space in science communication or journalism for both, right? So I'm much, much, much more of a storyteller than I am of sort of a literal or scientific mind. I'm much better at the creative process than the researcher. But, for example, generally I think of like more of like an investigative journalist as being quite detailed and needing, wanting the data, wanting to see the data, wanting to work with the data. That's a pretty different mind. And if you look at the bylines on any New York Times investigation, there's usually 3 or 4 people, and someone's a data person, someone's the story person, and then there's a few people who might weave those together or be the researcher, and they work as a team to create the piece. And I think that's a really successful model. And when we've done investigations, it's the same way. There might be a data dig. I'm told to go find the people, the 1 or 2, 3 stories that illustrate the data, and get them to share and open up and basically make you care about the information that the investigative journalists spend hours and days and weeks and months, that I am very grateful for, digging up. Francesco, Francesco, excuse me. Did you have a question? I think you might be muted, Francesco. Or maybe not. I can't hear. Can anyone hear? No? Anyone else have any further questions or thoughts about potentially how this could have gone differently?
Personally, I think transparency is a big thing for me, like what you were saying. I think like if I'm thinking from a non-scientist perspective, or even someone who doesn't study something related to that field, it's going to be hard to identify like what's potentially a fault in the study that's illustrated in the article. So unless the article strictly says something like, oh, this is what we think we know so far, but it's not a fact, or we're not sure that it's a fact yet, and it's still being studied, I think that it's going to be really easy for people to just like believe whatever is written in the article. So personally, I think transparency is a big thing for me.
Yeah, I agree. And I think sometimes we're trying to do it so quickly and so succinctly and so shortly that transparency gets lost. And that's a personal regret of mine, that I think we could have wrapped a lot of the information with a lot more, hedged a lot more. This is what we know right now. This is going to change likely. This is what we know from past pandemics and how things have changed. I think actually walking people through, this wasn't the first time a pandemic hit, but we acted like it was. And so I think walking people through, because a lot of people hadn't lived through the history through a pandemic before, walking them through those lessons, also could have been potentially more helpful. And now, unfortunately, I think we really have to build back all of that trust that was eroded. And so how do we do that? And I think it makes it even more important in our current landscape, where things are so polarized, that we do it really, really well.
I think one thing that I can think of from a researcher's perspective, because of the pandemic, there were a lot of opportunities to publish studies, and I think like that also drove like just there's so many studies about different things and what's the most important, or were they conducted ethically, and are the findings conclusive, or they're just trying to get the spotlight in the media. So I think like that also made me think about like in recent months or the recent year, like some more studies that are sensational, like the room temperature semiconductor superconductor material stuff. Like I guess, yeah, how do we as scientists like stop that from happening, and also like how does the media like interact or deal with such studies. Yeah.
I mean, part of it too is that we have to educate the public. Like our bar used to always be, okay, something has to be published in, one of the four main journals, like, JAMA, NGM, and EJM, and like, so the main journals. And during the pandemic, and had to be a double-blind placebo-controlled trial. Those were the bars. No animal studies. There were like a bar that you had to meet, which was basically it needed to be in human trials. It needed to be in a legit journal, and it needed to be relevant now. And that was no longer true. All of that was thrown out at the pandemic because people wanted, and I think understandably so, they wanted information. So suddenly we're talking to scientists about white papers, like things that they were just like throwing up on the internet. And that was getting headlines. And so that added to the chaos. Now, I think part of the problem is that most people don't know the difference between a white paper and a blind placebo-controlled trial, right? So how do you educate the public about these differences? And unfortunately, that takes time. And in a culture where your attention span is getting shorter and shorter, that's the more of a challenge. Again, I don't think that this is impossible, but I think it's really important to package things so that people can be continually learning about the process. And you're still only going to hit a certain part of the population, people who care and have time to really think critically. But those are hopefully who can also be the decision makers and making a difference in society because they are well educated and because you did do your job well. Any final questions in our final minutes?
Yeah, so Francesco typed out his question. He says there are a lot of institutions and individuals that intentionally erode trust in media for their own benefit, i.e. news stations and individuals who deride the mainstream media reporting on COVID safety precautions. How can the media combat that narrative? How does the media reach people who are susceptible to that kind of messaging?
In this environment, it's so tough, right? Because tribalism is so alive and well in the sense that you can basically just surround yourself in your echo chamber of what you want to hear. And now there's whole, media institutions and outlets and that can do that. So I think how you do that is basically human relations, in the sense that you probably, each one of you, every morning check the news somewhere and have trust if it's coming from Fox News or if it's coming from the Wall Street Journal, and maybe you check. My partner and I were talking about last night, like he only checks the New York Times. And I was like, why is that? And he's like, because over time, I have learned to trust their process and the way that they package things. And he's like, so I don't check Google News anymore. And so I feel like the way to combat or to answer this question from Francesco, which is not a super satisfying answer, but is like to do really good journalism. And then hopefully people are drawn to that over time. I have to hope that this is a moment that reverses back, that turns the ship, and that we eventually do have institutions and media that we care about. I mean, I have to have hope in that, or I wouldn't be a journalist. And I have to, believe that doing my job well will combat, sort of these media outlets who I do feel like are bent. And I think that comes from inside the organization. Organizations twist and turn, right? I don't know if you all saw the controversy, and I'll wrap up in our final minute here, but the controversy that came out last week where an editor at NPR called out the organization for not being forthcoming about their sort of race and gender agendas, and how that was sounded more like advocacy work than true impartial reporting. And being on the inside, I agree with them. And so, I think it comes from the organization themselves that they have to twist back and become an institution that is a reliable source of accurate, vetted information. And the more we can even call ourselves out on that, hopefully we will rebuild trust. That's why I say it's really similar to a human relationship, right? If a human breaks your trust, it takes a long time to build that back. And I feel like that's what happened during the pandemic, is we now have to build that back. The media, institutions, government officials going forward, hopefully before a civil war. Was that a horrible note to end on? I'm sorry. But I just, I think this is an important moment to care. So hopefully we'll do that well. Thank you all so much for your time. I put my email up earlier, but it's I'm pretty easy to find. It's lmcclurg@kqed.org. I'm on Twitter or X, wherever. Feel free to reach out to me anytime. I'm happy to answer your questions. Obviously, I care about this stuff, and I'll try to answer it with as much honesty and wisdom as I might have gained over the years. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much, Lesley. Thanks everyone for coming. Hope you enjoyed it.